Well, joining us now from London is British Conservative MP and former United Nations Commander in Bosnia, Colonel Bob Stewart. Thanks for being there.
Pleasure.
And how effective is this NATO operation likely to be when no one can even agree on who's in charge of it?
Well, I'm told by the Secretary of State for Defence here that we shouldn't worry too much about that. Below Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe, there's no problem there. The command and control below SHAPE, as we call it, is working well. It's just the politics that somehow got to catch up. I wouldn't worry too much about that. What worries me is what's going to happen from now on.
Yeah, I'll come to the detail of what's going on the ground in a moment, but the politics is important. I mean, the US wants to hand over the leadership of the operation as soon as possible. The French don't want NATO in charge of it, but Turkey is demanding that NATO be in charge precisely so Turkey can exercise its veto to stop the bombing. I mean, it is a pretty messy situation.
And it's a typical NATO problem. That's always been. I used to be the chief of policy in NATO. It is a problem. They will sort it in the end, but it does make a problem. The command and control of the troops on the ground, or rather, not in the ground, actually in the air, the command and control is working relatively well. There's still some problems, though, because the French are doing their own thing, the British and the Americans, and that's got to be a bit better coordinated.
Well, the French want to run the military operation under orders from NATO, but have the political operation outside of NATO. In fact, they want Arab countries involved as well from the Arab League. Would that actually be a good idea, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, the Arab League have supported this operation, and absolutely we should have Arabs there. I mean, it's an Arab problem. For goodness sake, the Arab League, the Arab world, this is in your sphere. We don't want to go into Libya. The British certainly don't. We were forced to go in there by what was about to happen. And because we did something, a lot of people are alive now who wouldn't be. Now let's solve it some other way.
And, of course, you get crisis points at each step along the way, and the latest crisis point is the town of Misrata, which has a population of about 300,000 people. It's been under fire from Gaddafi's tanks, from artillery and from snipers, and hundreds of people have been killed there, thousands wounded, evidently. The hospital's overwhelmed. Can you solve this kind of problem from the air? Because it looked like Gaddafi's forces have moved out, now they've moved back again.
No, you can't solve it from the air. You can stop it a bit from the air, but you can't solve it. You need what they call boots on the ground, and I'm afraid that has to be provided by the Libyan opposition. We cannot do that. That's one step too far for us.
Well, you have personally advocated that the West step in and arm this Libyan opposition, the people you call freedom fighters. Can you imagine that happening?
Yes, I can, actually. There's moves now to try and change the orders with regard to the arms embargo. And I can see that happening. I can particularly see that happening if other Arab nations were to assist their brothers in Benghazi and Misrata by providing them with weapons and possibly instructors. You can't just give weapons out. They've got to be instructed on how to use them. I can see that happening. And indeed, I can see some of the Western nations are arming the rebels once we are clear on the legality of it. And I can tell you a heck of a lot of work is going on now as to exactly what we can do legally.
Is the British government prepared to move in that direction, do you think? I mean, you'd be in pretty close contact with the people who are decision makers. I know that virtually every time you get the opportunity, you're raising questions in the House of Commons about this.
I asked Prime Minister David Cameron this question last Friday, and he gave an answer like we're having a look at exactly what we can do. In other words, not yes and not no. I mean, quite frankly, this cannot go on forever. I mean, the nightmare scenario is where Gaddafi controls the West and the rebels control the East, and the country's split. And therefore, we would have to maintain some kind of no-fly zone or no-combat zone over the east of the country. We can't do that forever. So it's in our interest for this problem to be resolved. And in my view, the resolution involves the removal of Gaddafi.
There is a problem, of course, with the Americans, because they say, publicly at least, that they're not even communicating directly with the people that you describe as freedom fighters, the rebels on the ground, because they don't want to get involved directly in a civil war.
Well, we most definitely are communicating with them, we the British, because actually we've already had diplomats on the ground. We had a rather embarrassing incident last week where a diplomatic mission with special forces was sort of arrested by farmers. These things do happen. We most definitely are in contact with them. Personally, I also spoke to a man who was actually in Tripoli, who was an opponent of Gaddafi. Now, these are the people that I'm really worried about, because Gaddafi threatened less than a week ago, once he gets into Benghazi, to go through from house to house, room to room, slaughtering anyone he could find. That's what he said. I have no reason to believe that he won't be doing that sort of thing in Tripoli at this moment. So time is not on our side to try and stop people dying. And that's what we're trying to do, to try and stop people dying. It's not our business to decide exactly how Libya is run. That's up to the Libyan people, and we mustn't get involved in that.
Did you have any doubts at all when you began calling for Western military intervention? That this was, in fact, the right thing to do? Certainly it's the moral thing to do, but is it strategically the right thing to do?
It never is strategically the right thing to do when you actually unleash the military. Well, that's not fair, but you see what I mean? It's very difficult. We didn't want to go in there. The last thing we want to do is spend a huge amount of money on another military activity abroad. That's the last thing we want to do. But as you mentioned in your introduction, someone like myself that has seen what happens when guns are turned on civilian populations mercilessly, for me, we had no choice. Whatever the economic circumstances, whatever the risks, whatever the fact that we don't know what the end game will be. Everyone says, what's the end game? I'll tell you, we don't know what the end game is. God knows what the end game is. We certainly don't do, but we can't just sit by. We started the game. Plot one, or phase one, was to stop people dying. Now we've got to go from there. We can't have an end game worked out right to the end always. Life isn't like that. It's not black and white. It's always mucky. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, this week there are a heck of a lot of people alive in Libya that might not have been if we hadn't acted last weekend.
Are there lessons to be drawn from history here? Because you are talking to a younger generation of politicians in the British Parliament. I mean, they were pretty young when you were in Bosnia, for example. But are there lessons from Bosnia and perhaps even more importantly from the aerial intervention over Kosovo in Serbia?
Yes, I mean, the main lesson, I'm sure anyone going back in history would have taken this one. If you're going to do something, do it as soon as possible and act with decision. If you're not going to do something, don't. Don't go halfway. Get in there, sort it out as best you can, and get on with it. Don't just leave it sort of swinging in the wind. If you leave it swinging in the wind, people like Gaddafi will move fast and actually obliterate their opposition. That's what he was trying to do, until, of course, the airstrikes stopped him literally in his tracks, and thank goodness they did.
I imagine you've been watching this pretty closely with a strategic mind, I suppose, or a military mind. Can you tell us what your understanding is of what actually is going on outside and in and around Misrata, this city under siege?
What is happening is actually that Gaddafi has moved his armour and his troops into Misrata, and actually they're having success because the rebels there haven't got many of them and they haven't got weapons. Now, how the heck we resolve that, why we, but how the heck they resolve it, I don't know. Personally, I think we should get on with deciding whether we can arm the rebels and actually do it. Again, I go back to the lesson of history. The lesson of history is if you're going to do it and do it with decision. And I would very much like to see the legalistic side of this crisis sorted out so that we can actually allow the passage of arms to those people who are opposing Gaddafi, because Gaddafi will be utterly ruthless and we cannot actually control what he does from the ground. When he fires an artillery piece, if he fires that artillery piece, we can probably target it. What we can't target are people moving through the streets at night with weapons and taking out anyone that's an opponent.
Could you imagine in that case a serious case a moral case or a military case for putting British or NATO troops on the ground as a last resort to protect civilians?
Yes, there's certainly a moral case for that. We're actually not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to put ground-holding troops on the ground according to the Security Council Resolution 1973. But there is a moral case for doing that. It might be something that the Arab world could do. We have this problem because every time we act in the Middle East, and that includes fantastic contributions, may I say, from Australian forces who, as soon as I discover that we're alongside the Australians, my heart leaps because, frankly, it means we've got really good soldiers, sailors and airmen alongside us. But, frankly, someone's got to do something. I cannot see the British going in. We just don't have anyone left, actually. And anyway, we must carry out Security Council Resolution 1973, which says no ground-holding troops. It doesn't, interestingly enough, rule out the fact that you might have spotters or you might have people saying, you can't attack that target, there's civilians around there. And maybe that happened when the Phantoms that flew from the United Kingdom, round trip 3,000 miles, when they approached their targets, there were actually Reuters newsmen on the ground, and someone said, you can't attack the targets, there's civilians in the area, and they had to turn around and go back.
So, I mean, what we're contemplating here is the likelihood, in fact, there are special forces on the ground directing the operations to some degree.
I don't think people ever comment like that, but who knows? Maybe.
Yeah. What about the other prospect that British or NATO trainers and people who can hand out and teach people how to use weapons would go into a secure area like Benghazi or Tobruk? They wouldn't be holding ground as such, but they would be on the ground doing immediate training.
I'm up for that. I don't have a problem with that. That's not, in my view, in contravention of Security Council Resolution 1973, as long as we don't put troops that are going there to fight or hold ground, but actually assuming the legal side of it is sorted out, and we've got to make sure that whatever we do is in accordance with international law. If international law allows us to do it, I'm up for it. I mean, I cannot see this. We must not allow this stalemate to go on and on and on. Gaddafi's got to go. The Libyan people have got to have their say as to what happens. One problem for me is that we may have just got hold of the tiger's tail, and that actually we're going to get something pretty ghastly. But the fact of the matter is, we are not in command of what happens in Libya when the Libyan people decide what they want. But the crucial point is, it's up to the Libyan people. They're the people that decide their own destiny, not us.
There is a catch-all phrase in the latest Security Council resolution. At the end of it, it says all necessary measures to protect civilians. Could that be interpreted as including the assassination of Gaddafi?
The capitation.
Assassination.
I think it could. I mean, yes, the assassination. Yeah, I think it possibly could, under the circumstances that Gaddafi's in a military compound controlling operations. So I suggest he doesn't go to one of those military compounds controlling operations, because just by chance he might be taken out if that was the case. But as things stand, how do you extend the mandate? I'm used to this. I had a mandate that was pretty weak, and I tried to extend it as much as possible in Bosnia in 1992-93. Does protecting civilians extend to actually protecting them by stopping the man that's giving the orders to actually kill them? If you protect civilians, can you extend that mandate to actually take out the man that's giving the orders? Maybe you can. Maybe you can't. You know what? Right at this moment, I've got a feeling I'm going towards the former. But we've got to do everything very carefully and legally, and crucially with the support of the Arab world.
Bob Stewart, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us tonight.
A pleasure.